I'm going to be giving a guest lecture today over Bourdieu. And what better way to learn about someone than to creep on him, right? So we're going to look at a profile I made for him. And I just want to let you guys know that the first few slides, like the biographical information, I'm going to go pretty quickly, so don't really worry about taking notes. That's why I made you guys that handout. It's kind of more detailed, has a little bit more information than what the PowerPoint has, right? So to start off, we can see that Bourdieu was born in 1930 and he lived until 2002. He passed away from cancer, but during his time, he was known as an academic writer, a public intellectual, and most importantly, an influential social theorist, right? So he was born in a small town in France to a working class background. His father was a farmer, then turned into a postman, so, you know, pretty modest background, not a lavish lifestyle, right? But that didn't hinder his education, okay? So even though he came from a working class background, obviously we know that he did very well, right? He was a good student, he got into prestigious schools, and he eventually gained his doctorate in philosophy. After gaining his education, he worked at various jobs. He worked at a university first, but then he got into the military, went to Algeria, served his time there, and then after the war he actually stayed in Algeria, taught at the University of Algiers. During that time he did an ethnographic study over an indigenous group, and then he published that work, which became his first book, The Algiers, and that kind of got his career rolling, right? Over his lifetime he published over 300 articles and essays and more than 40 books. And in his work, we can see kind of this Marxist influence, right? He picked up this Marxist orientation during his education in France. He never really considered himself a Marxist sociologist, so to say, but we can definitely see this Marxist impact on his work, especially with the concept that we're going to be focusing on today, which is capital, right? So Marx had that idea of economic capital, and then Bourdieu took that and built it and said, hey, there's not just economic capital, we have these other forms too. So like I said, we're going to focus on this idea of capital for our lecture today, but what I really want you guys to think about while we're talking about this are two things. One, how capital dictates your social position, right? Where does it put you within the social class system? And two, how do these forms of capital work together to create inequality, right? Sorry about that. Okay, so to start off, as you guys should know from your readings, we got the three forms. We have economic, social, and cultural. How many people have seen Wolf on Wall Street? Show of hands. All right, cool. So we kind of know the background, right? He starts off, he's not really wealthy, right? Goes to Wall Street trying to hit it big, gets his first chance, and then the stock market crashes, right? So then he's like, I'm going to sell penny stocks. But he's smart, right? So he sells these penny stocks to these big investors and gets that cash back. So what's that do, right? That builds his economic capital, and it builds it pretty quickly. He has a lot of money, right? So with this economic capital, he can buy, you know, lavish homes, he can buy nice cars, and he can buy, you know, other assets that he likes to partake in during the movie that we won't really talk about, but I'm sure you guys know. So that's what economic capital is about, right? It's all about money, okay? But what else does he need in the movie to sustain that high position? It's not just economic capital, right? He needs social capital. So what's social capital? It's those networks, right? It's bonds between one another. So when we think about the movie, and he's starting off his business, we meet his merry men, right? His best friends. And you might be wondering, well, when you start the movie, how are these people going to help him, right? They're, for lack of a better term, they're kind of losers, right? They trade things, they sell things that are the lowest of the low, not very prosperous. But what we do learn is they have a lot of social capital, right? Most importantly, Jonah Hill's character, who was his childhood friend? Steve Madden, right? And this is important. And why is this important? because they gain that social capital, and not only does it gain their capital, it legitimizes their business, right? So it helps their economic capital as well. By gaining that connection to Steve Madden, they're able to take their business live, right? They're not just these slums selling penny stocks anymore. They're a real Wall Street, stock business, right? And we can see some other social capital within the movie too. This guy, his college friend, he's the Swiss banker, right? He has that connection, and that's important because that helps sustain DiCaprio's economic capital, right? He needs that Swiss bank account so he can keep that position, keep his money, right? Another network is his wife. Through his wife, he has the connection to the aunt, who in turn transfers that money to the Swiss bank accounts, right? And there's another person who helps the rat hole, right? I don't remember his specific name, but he's got the black hair, and his wife has the passport too. So that's another form of social capital, right? They're gaining those connections. So when we think about social capital, it's not economic, right? It doesn't deal with money. It's all about these trusted relationships, right? Grouping. So since we kind of looked at it on a bigger scale, right? This is kind of corporate networking, fictional networking in a way, right? How can we see social capital for ourselves? How do we as college students have social capital? Yeah?
Through LinkedIn, that website that connects people.
Good, yes, right. So you can make connections online, right? What other ways do we have social capital? Can you guys think of? Yeah?
Through alumni.
Good, excellent. So through alumni, you might be able to get job opportunities later, right? So being connected with groups, making connections online, we're building our social capital already, right? So before we move on, does anyone have any questions over economic or social capital? Everyone's good? All right. So now we're going to get into cultural capital. And cultural capital is kind of the big one, okay? There's a lot of parts to it, but it's all right. We'll get through it. We'll understand it by the end. So when we talk about cultural capital, we're talking about these skills and tastes and knowledge that people have, right? So why is this important? How does this build this inequality, our class structure, right? This collective identity? Well, if you share the same tastes of movies, or the same skill set, or the same knowledge, you're probably going to associate with the same people, right? So that forms that collective identity. You're hanging out with people that are similar to you, okay? So that relates to inequality, right? Once we create those collective identities, those social groups, those social classes, it's hard to break into that, right? If you don't have these skills or these tastes that they have, you can't relate to them, right? So we see how that divide works. So just to share a little bit with you, illustrate cultural capital a little bit more. I used to lack cultural capital, and I probably still do. But when I started higher education, I went to Shawnee State University. Anyone know where that is? Down in Portsmouth, right? So I started at Shawnee. I graduated from high school, right? I was a good student. Had straight A's, the honor roll, the whole shebang, whatever. Went down there, almost failed, right? Went my freshman year, it was awful. Hate to share this, but I think it shows a good point. I went to class, ended my freshman year, my first semester anyway, with a D, an F, and 2 B's. It was awful. And I couldn't understand it, right? I was a good student, I had straight A's. Why am I not getting this, right? What's wrong? Why lack cultural capital, I didn't have the skills or the knowledge that was needed for the academic world, right? Walked into my comp class, and they're saying, hey, you need to write to this audience, you got to do this tone, you have to cite this way, you need to know this format. I didn't know that, right? I came from a really small rural high school. They didn't really emphasize that, So I lacked that skill, that knowledge, that capital. But I built it over time, right? Because over the 4 years, I was surrounded by academics, right? So So I learned that capital. I built that collective identity with them. Okay? So that's kind of what cultural capital is like. You know, lacking the skills or having the skills and the credentials needed to put you in a different position in class. Now, cultural capital has 3 forms it takes, right? And the first form is embodied. And when we think about embodied cultural capital, it's stuff that's physically ingrained in you, right? You already know this. And one of the best examples would be language. So if we look at this map of the United States, we can see the different dialects and the different languages across the states, right? So if we look here, we're in the Southern Appalachian dialect, right? And some of us might not be from here, and that's fine. But we're accustomed to that language. We grow up learning certain terms, certain slang that we think is proper and appropriate. But, say, if we go to California, if we go down to Texas, up to Maine, it's not the same, right? The language is different. They have a different type of capital, right? They have other slang that we're not familiar with. So if we go there, we might be viewed as having less cultural capital, right? Because we have an accent, or we don't know what they're talking about when they say certain phrases, okay? But that could be applied if someone comes to our area too. We could think of them as having more cultural capital because they speak more proper or use different words. Or we might think of them as having less cultural capital because they don't know our terminology, right? So that's kind of what embodied is. The second form of cultural capital is objectified. And objectified is kind of how we measure people up in society, right? You look at people, you see what clothes they wear, what type of phone they have, what kind of car they drive, and we kind of determine what their social class is based on that, okay? So when we think of objectified, we're thinking of those material objects that people attain to position themselves within society. So you guys had a reading, or it was like a little blog post about Apple products, right? Everyone remember that? Maybe, sort of?
Yeah, right?
Okay, so how are Apple products a form of objectified cultural capital?
Jessica, you were nodding, weren't you? Yeah, what do you think?
The article mentioned that, I mean, Apple products are something that almost everyone uses. But they also mentioned something about how the workers were mistreated.
That's all right. That's good. That's good.
Let someone else help her out.
Yeah.
It's like built this like I don't know stigma that it like is a huge company and like it's better than anything else.
Good.
So if you own it, you like feel like prestigious in a way.
Good. Right. So if you own an Apple, you increase your cultural capital because you don't have a Samsung, right? You gotta have the rose gold iPhone 6. That's
Plus S plus.
S plus. That is what gives you cultural capital, right? It says that, hey, I have this. I made myself better, you know? So that's that form of material objects where we determine, you know, how much capital you have, right? So our last form is institutionalized. And this is kind of how society determines your social, or your cultural capital, I'm sorry. And it's all about the knowledge, right? Specialized knowledge, getting your credentials. So you guys are going to graduate from a high university, and you're going to have a bachelor's degree, right? So you're going to have more cultural capital than someone who has a high school degree, okay? But a master's has more cultural capital than a bachelor's, right? And the same with a PhD compared to a master's. So as you gain those educational credentials, you're building your cultural capital, right? So does anyone have any questions over those? Do we all feel pretty confident on the different forms of cultural capital? Okay. So now that we kind of understand this, understand the forms, how does it start? right? How do we know what is valued and, you know, the most cultural capital? How do we know who determines that? Well, Bourdieu says it's through this process of transmission of cultural capital, right? So what transmission of cultural capital means is that the upper class, the dominant class, right, they determine what is classy, what's valued in society, okay? And then over time, we slowly see it trickle down the class system, right? So the other social systems see what they should be doing as proper behavior, okay? So I'm going to show you guys a short little clip just to illustrate how transmission of cultural capital works.
But someone was crying, and I want to know who it was.
Well, it's a long story, okay? But my stupid friend Jerry told my other friend Noreen that she was... Hey, you want to hear something weird? Mr. Pitt eats his Snickers bars with a knife and fork.
Really?
Yes.
Why does he do that? He probably doesn't want to get chocolate on his fingers. That's the way the society types eat their candy bars. Forgive me for trying to class up this place. For trying to have the Yankees reach another strata of society that might not watch Channel 11.
What the hell are you doing?
I am eating my dessert. How do you eat it? With your hands?
He's kind of a baritone, isn't he? What are you doing? I'm eating this cookie. No, but why are you using a knife and a fork? Did you just think of that? No, I've seen people do it. I like it. Here's your knife and fork.
Look, she's cutting up an almond joy.
I just don't get it.
You know, I saw someone on the street eating M&M's with a spoon.
What is wrong with everybody?
Look, they're doing it. They're all doing it.
What is wrong with all you people?
Okay, so through this video, we can kind of see how that transmission of cultural capital works, right? Elaine's boss is kind of the dominant class. He's the elitist type, Mr. Pitt. And then once he starts eating it, and Elaine, starts eating it with a knife and fork, right? Elaine tells Jerry and George, and then George is like, this is what we should be doing. This is proper, you know? This is better etiquette, right? And then we can slowly see it trickle down to other people, okay? So, for the last thing to kind of illustrate what we've been talking about, I'm going to show you guys another clip. It's about 6 minutes long, but I want you guys to be thinking of how capital is working in this video, right? So after the video, let's talk about what forms of capital are in this video, what capital do these students have, what do they lack, do they gain capital, all those kinds of questions, okay?
For me, being a first-generation college student is...
Everything's a little bit harder.
A great privilege, but also a high responsibility.
There's not a lot of room for error. I'm the second person ever from my high school to go to an Ivy League school.
My dad works as a taxi driver.
It means that I'm still able to do just as well as my peers who've maybe had better resources.
Sort of like a blessing and a curse.
My experience as a first-generation student.
Persevering.
Resilience.
Difficult.
For me personally, making friends at Brown was a little bit difficult just because I had never been surrounded by people who were this rich in my entire life. Because you're sort of wondering, okay, like, what do I have in common with these people? Like, do I sort of truly belong? I do feel like first-generation college students do need support that's different from the support that's typically offered to students. There's oftentimes a lot of assumptions about what we know, that we know how to go and talk to professors, that we know how to network, that we know how to use office hours, that our parents know everything that's going on. So much of my life here is like focusing on classes and like these esoteric like authors that, you know, my family isn't used to talking about.
The power is invested in Marxist critique in the economy.
Oftentimes, like, I'll call home and like the only thing that we have to talk about is like, how's the weather? On the other hand, I think there are times where I feel really proud. Like, I'll call my mom back home and I'll be like, you will not believe, like, this kid like doesn't know how to do their own laundry. Like, how do you go so long without knowing how to do your own laundry? And I just feel really proud because I know how to like take care of myself, right? And that's something that like my family has taught me to do.
My first generation college student experience.
Rewarding.
Crazy.
That you need to know what you're doing.
In some ways, I'm privileged as a first-gen student because I'm white. But class privilege is a different issue. I didn't want to paint myself as being different from other students. That's a hard thing to admit. Being first-gen and being gay means that I'm coming from a background that a lot of students aren't. I had to get a job on campus pretty quickly. The university bought me a suit junior year because I did have to do these interviews and I didn't have access to the money to buy that suit. Literally, whether or not you get the job could depend on, you know, how well your clothes fit you. It's a really hard ordeal, right, to approach that space with confidence and to be able to speak on the same degree that everyone else is speaking. Like, you need to be comfortable with how you look.
My experience?
Exhausting.
Struggle.
Work.
Insight.
Emotional.
Different.
When I compare myself to other students at Brown, sometimes I get angry at them if they complain about being really busy, and I know that everyone's really busy here. I think like, well, they don't work. They're busy like improving their resume, you know. My first job was actually working as a food server in the student dining services while I was making salads. My dorm mates were in the sciences library, finishing up their problem sets for chemistry. I'm originally from Colombia. My family moved here when I was 6. If I'm like trying to conceal my first gen identity, I don't mention work. I don't mention my family life really.
Where are you from?
I'm from New Jersey.
New Jersey?
If that's where I'm from, I say New Jersey, you know, because like New Jersey, like anyone can be from New Jersey.
You get a lot of students from New York and New Jersey.
Sometimes I would tell professors about my background because I just don't want to seem like a burden, and I don't want to like them to pity me because like I think I'm really capable. So I often just like act as if I'm just like any other student that goes here.
IBG started as a project between friends who wanted to explore what it meant to be first-generation college students. It actually is pretty surprising to see how much IBG has grown. Now to this conference that's spanning all across the Ivy League.
You can always learn the Renaissance painter, but you can't always learn some of the values that you guys have.
The one thing I really hope that people get out of the conference is the feeling that they're not alone, because they aren't.
I remember the first time I told my mom about a job that I got on campus. I was making around $14, $15 an hour, and she was just so shocked that I was already making what she took years to be able to make.
For the most part, I am proud that I am a first generation student. My grandma, I learned, is literate, so knowing just like how far my family has come from that is very, very humbling.
Ever since I was a freshman, like I've been saving up to be able to like afford my mom's plane ticket here. None of my family has ever been able to afford to visit Brown. And so probably the only time that they'll be on this campus is when I graduate. I don't know if everyone like has to think about, you know, their life in college that way.
It's a reality that these institutions were created by white people and created for white people at the time. And so white privilege, yes, it does exist. But now when you have a lot of people of color, a lot of first-gen folk coming into these schools in large numbers, that privilege is being challenged.
What makes me most proud to be a first-generation college student definitely has to be the empathy I have, which is one of the big issues in America, is that there's an empathy gap. And I think that puts me in a unique position to kind of push forth a lot of change that needs to happen.
There we go. Okay. So what type of capital did we see in that movie? Or flip, I guess. Yeah.
Economic.
Economic, right. So how did we see economic?
I think one example, the second guy was talking about how he couldn't afford a suit, and he said that if like the interviewer or whatever didn't like what you were wearing, you probably wouldn't get the job.
Good, right? So what other forms of capital are there? Economic, that's a great example from it. Yeah.
Cultural.
Cultural. So how do we see cultural capital?
The guy mentioned that he met someone that couldn't do laundry,
Mm-hmm.
and he had more cultural capital because he knew how to take care of himself.
Good, right? He knew a different skill that someone of like the upper class didn't, right? So we see that difference in cultural capital on different levels, right? Are there any other? Yeah.
Another cultural would be all of them going to Brown, like they all mentioned.
Good. So even though these first-gen students kind of lack some capital, they're building it and they're creating that collective identity, right? So do we see anything else? Yeah.
Social capital.
Good.
Where they don't have like a support system that understands like the whole school thing
Mm-hmm.
in their family.
Yeah, right? They didn't have that networking, right? But did they have some sense of social capital? I kind of question this because you're right? They lack that. They're first gen, they don't know the networking process. But how did they get to Brown, right? So maybe they had a little bit of social capital, right? Is there anything else that we can see in the video? Yeah.
For social capital, they also like started that group for the first generation.
Very
so they're networking with each other.
Yes, yes. So they build their social capital by making those group memberships, right? Awesome. Okay, so does anyone have any questions about Bourdieu's concept of capital? Right? So what we learned today, we got the three forms, which are economic, social, and cultural, right? And then we have our three forms of cultural capital, which are embodied, objectified, and institutionalized, okay? And then we see how transmission of cultural capital determines what is valued and what is not, right? But most importantly, we see how these forms of capital can work together to create that collective identity that we saw in the clip, right? And that source of inequality, right? Making the cliques, right? The inner and the outer groups, okay? So just to finish up, I'm not quite sure how many people are in here, but I kind of have a class activity for you guys that I'm going to pass around. If you would get into about 5 or 6 groups, and I'm going to give you guys this little table, right? So we have a lot of economic capital, a little bit of economic capital, a lot of cultural capital, and a little bit of cultural capital. So when you're in your groups, and I'll give you guys a number for your group so you know which topic you'll have, I want you to think about if you have a lot of economic capital and a little cultural capital, what type of food would you eat, right? Where would you go? What clothing would you wear? Where would you shop? That type of stuff, okay? So just
The
divide
groups of
yourself up.
4, so just find 4 people to sit with, 3 others.
All right.
Turn your chairs.